I'm about to horrify you. I'm about to ruin your day. And it's not my objective to ruin your day, but it's my objective to prepare you and to make sure you live a happy life long term in your life, regardless of what happens to the external world. There is something that is going to happen most likely in our lifetimes, and it's something I have not even brought up before. I talk a lot about this fact that we are in a current state of Western collapse. That's accurate. I talk about how the world has entered into a dark age that will probably last several decades. That is also accurate. But there is something else that may or may not be worse than all this that I haven't even brought up. And I was waiting for a particular time to bring this up after certain things that occurred in the world for me to bring this up because I wasn't sure about it, although now I am. And it's just one singular simple thought. And let me explain what that is. What was the death rate, the worldwide average death rate of the cerveza sickness? What was that? Now, if you look at the stats, it was approximately 1%. Okay? Yes, you can nitpick that number. And it also depends on pre-jab or post-jab, when they had it, when they didn't have it. The death rate certainly went down when they invented it and things like that. Yes, there are some statistics that say it was 0.8%. There are some that would say it was 1.6%. But I'm just going to say 1% because it's about 1%. If you want to nitpick it, feel free to do so. But any nitpick number you come up with is going to be very close to 1%. So for the remainder of this video, for you nitpickers, I'm going to say 1%. That was the death rate of the cerveza sickness on average around the world. And I'm going to add another fact to that. The vast majority of the people who died under cerveza sickness, as you probably already know, were people who were already very old and fat and had hardcore pre-existing medical conditions. I believe the number was at least 2.5 or 3 pre-existing serious medical conditions for the average person who died under their cerveza sickness. Now, yes, of course, you're going to bring up the exceptions rule. Hey, I know a guy who was 38 years old and he died. So F you, Caleb. The exception proves the rule. We're not talking about the exceptions to the rule. We're talking about the majority of people who died. My understanding from the statistics is the average person who died was 80 years old, which is the average age of life expectancy, the average age at which people die anyway. That is not to diminish these deaths. I'm not talking about that. I said before on videos regarding cerveza sickness that my parents are in their 80s and I was worried for their health and I wanted them to get the jab and they did. And I wanted them to be careful and stay home because I didn't want them to die. So I'm not taking this lightly. I'm leading up to something that is much bigger than this. I'm almost there. Now, because we had a pandemic where the death rate was 1% and the vast majority are people who are already very old, very fat, blah, 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 okay? What was the reaction of the world? You know, the world went insane. The world went completely apeshit. The entire world, more or less, yet there are some exceptions. The entire world lost its mind. Companies, corporations all over the world lost their minds. People lost their minds. Governments certainly lost their minds. Lockdowns, restrictions, mask mandates, social distancing rules, all kinds of shutting down borders, trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars that were destroyed, millions upon millions of small businesses that were completely wiped out through no fault of their own. We could go on and on about all the horrible things that governments and corporations and various groups of people did during cerveza sickness over the past year and a half, 2 years, that were in many cases massive and ridiculous overreactions. In some cases, they were prudent. It really depends on it. I am not here today to debate whether or not there was an overreaction or not. That becomes a very stupid left versus right argument where right-wingers assume it was a hoax and bullshit and no one should have done anything, and left-wingers lost their minds as if the death rate was 50% and said if you don't wear a mask, you're killing grandpa. Both sides lost their minds during this. I did a video about this when this all started, where you had left-wingers saying, oh my God, you gotta wear a mask or you'll kill me. People in their 20s, healthy people in their 20s and 30s were saying this, okay? Then you had the Trump supporters saying, oh my God, I can't wear a mask. I'll have to breathe my carbon dioxide for 7 minutes. Fuck you. Which is factually inaccurate because carbon dioxide goes right through the mask. Anyway, my point is everyone lost their goddamn minds. Everybody, with rare exceptions. The whole world lost its shit when we had a pandemic with a death rate of 1%. 1%, and the vast majority were old people who are overweight, blah, blah, blah. Now, what if we have another pandemic? Only this time, the death rate is 5%. Think about that for a minute. Just think about that for a second. If you saw what the world did with 1%, how will the world react next time when it's 5%, not 25% or 50%, not Black Plague stuff or Spanish flu stuff. 5%, 7%, 10%, 4%. You saw what they did with 1%. What happens if it's 9%? Just think about that for a minute. How is the world going to react? How is your government going to react? How are the governments of most of the countries of the world going to react? How are most people going to react? Both insane left-wingers and insane Trump supporters. How are they going to react? How are they going to react to each other? How are companies going to react? How are you going to be able to travel? How are you going to be able to make money? What's going to happen? Now, let me give you another scenario, okay? Let's say there's another pandemic in our lifetimes, and the death rate is only 1%. Okay, it's the same as cerveza sickness. The death rate is only 1%, except this time, instead of fat, old, sick people dying, it's little kids. It's a death rate of 1%, but everyone dying, or the vast majority of people dying, are little kids. How do you think the world is going to react when a bunch of little kids start dying? Even if the death rate is only 1%. Think about that. Do you see what I'm saying? Do you understand that the odds are decent? I don't know what the exact odds are, but the odds are decent that in our lifetimes, there will be another worldwide pandemic. Someone will do something stupid at some lab again. That will probably happen again. I don't know if it'll probably happen again, but the odds are decent. Maybe it's 20%, 30%, 40%. Maybe it's under 50%, but the odds are decent. It's not 1 or 2%, not 2% rule. It's at least 10, 15%, right? Somewhere in there for the rest of your life. I don't mean next year. I don't mean the year after. I mean, it could be in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. But in your lifetime, the odds are decent. We will encounter another worldwide pandemic. And what happens if it's even a little worse? Now, God forbid if it's much worse. If it's much worse, yeah. But what if it's a little worse? 5% instead of 1%. 1%, but it's all little kids. Do you see why I talk so much on this channel about how you need location-independent income that you completely control? Do you see why I talk about how you should probably set up an international backup plan so you can get the hell out of your current collapsing authoritarian high-tax Western country if you need? Do you see why I talk about you should probably leave your country? Most of you watching this video are living in a country right now that you shouldn't be in, that are going to handle the next pandemic far worse than many other countries. One of the reasons, I've said this before, one of the reasons I live in Dubai, one of the reasons that was the country I chose to move to right in the middle of cerveza sickness, is because it was one of the only countries in the world where their borders were open and they let you in. Whereas everyone else was freaking out and losing their minds, the UAE was comparatively, now they did have a single lockdown that lasted about a month, and that was it, and they were done. From that point on, they let foreign travelers in, and they were cool with it. So some countries handle this horribly, some countries handle this and a few countries handle this well. Are you in a country that handled the cerveza sickness very well? So then, if you stay in that country, and the next pandemic comes around, and it's 5% instead of 1%, what do you think is going to happen to you? Do you see my point? Now, this is irrelevant of, and on top of, and in addition to the Western world collapsing, the United States collapsing, Canada collapsing, Europe collapsing, the dark age which we have entered, all the problems with Europe right now with the war in Ukraine and things are like that are going to get worse. These are on top of the possibility of another pandemic in our lifetimes that is the same or worse. By the way, the pandemic could be the same. It could be almost identical to cerveza. We have a worldwide pandemic. The death rate is 1%. The only people dying are really old, fat people, more or less, statistically. Okay. What happens then? People are going to lose their fucking minds again, aren't they? And I'm saying if the odds are decent, this is going to happen again. The odds are just as decent. It's going to be at least a little worse. And as I said, it doesn't have to be much worse. Instead of 1%, it could be 3%. Just 3%. Think about that for a minute. How the world would react. Don't wait. Build your location-independent Alpha 2.0 business, small business that you control, that generates a cash flow for you every month, at least $85,000 a year in US dollars, pre-tax net. Number 2, move out of your Western country if you live in a Western country. Or number 3, set up an international backup plan so you have somewhere to go if and when another pandemic or some other problem, war, economic collapse, authoritarian strongman comes into power, whatever, you have somewhere to go. Do you see why this is so important? And I haven't even brought this up because I wanted to make sure the statistics were solid before I even talked about this. I just watched the world lose its fucking mind with a flu with a 1% death rate. The odds are decent that's going to happen again. It's going to be worse. And the only question is, will you be prepared? I mean, it makes sense. If you've never encountered a pandemic before in your life, it makes sense. It's still a little silly, but it makes sense that you were caught unawares by this the first time. If you're caught unawares the second time, that means you're stupid. Right? That just means you just weren't paying attention. You were lazy. I don't know what you're thinking. I don't know what you're doing. Or you could ignore everything I'm saying and just stay in the United States, stay in Canada, stay in Western Europe, just stay there, hang out. Oh, everything will be fine. I don't want to move. It's too much trouble. I'll just stay right here and everything will be great. And there's another pandemic. I'll freak out like everybody else and I'll get on the internet and scream and holler at everybody else and get really mad about politics and it'll fuck my life. And that's just the way it goes. I want you to be long-term happy. I want you to be long-term successful. That's my goal here. That's part of my mission, is to make sure that you're successful and make sure you're happy. Those of you who want to take action to do this. The odds are overwhelming this is going to happen again. Will you be ready? It's up to you. One of the things you have to implement is the 72-hour rule. Where can you be in 72 hours in terms of your international plan B? And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you should watch that video right there on how you formulate that plan, and I'll see you in that video.